I am William Stanton, 65 years old, and a retired structural engineer who spent a lifetime building indestructible foundations. Yet I somehow failed to see the cracks in my own family. After my wife Catherine passed away, I found solace volunteering the night shift at our local metropolitan medical center. Every night, the same rideshare driver brought me home, and every night I bought him a black coffee. It was a simple, quiet routine. But last Tuesday, he drove right past my affluent suburban neighborhood, locked the doors, and pulled into a dark industrial park. He handed me my coffee, looked me dead in the eye, and said the words that would burn my world to the ground. He told me not to go home, that he would explain later, and that I needed to trust him. Before I continue this story and reveal exactly how I dismantled my greedy children's lives piece by piece, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting a parent should come with devastating consequences. The automatic doors of the Metropolitan Medical Center slid shut behind me, cutting off the harsh fluorescent light and the smell of antiseptic. The November air was sharp and bitter cold. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my shoulders. I carried 2 large black coffees in a cardboard carrier, the heat seeping through my leather gloves. It was 1 in the morning. For the past 6 months, since the cancer finally took Catherine, this had been my salvation. I organized inventory in the pediatric ward while the rest of the world slept. It kept my mind occupied. It kept me out of the massive, empty estate that echoed with the memory of my wife. A dark gray sedan pulled up to the curb. The headlights cut through the light fog rolling off the concrete. I recognized the license plate immediately. It was Daniel. He was a quiet, observant man in his early 30s who had somehow become my regular driver. We rarely spoke beyond a brief greeting, but there was a mutual understanding of grief in his eyes. I opened the back door, slid onto the worn fabric seat, and handed him one of the coffees. He accepted it with a nod. I settled back, expecting the familiar 20-minute drive down the interstate toward the wealthy northern suburbs where my estate sat behind wrought iron gates. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of the engine lull me into a state of numbness. 10 minutes passed. The rhythm of the road felt wrong. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. We were not on the interstate. The streetlights had vanished, replaced by the towering, rusted silhouettes of shipping containers and chain-link fences. We were deep inside the southern industrial park, miles away from my home. A heavy metallic thud echoed through the cabin. Daniel had engaged the child locks on the rear doors. He reached forward and turned off the glowing rideshare application on his dashboard. The screen went dark. The engine idled to a low growl as he pulled behind a massive abandoned warehouse and shifted the car into park. The silence in the car was absolute. I did not panic. You do not spend 40 years engineering skyscrapers to withstand earthquakes by panicking at the first sign of structural failure. I kept my voice perfectly level and asked him what he was doing. Daniel turned around in his seat. The shadows hid his expression, but his voice was completely steady. He handed my coffee back to me. He told me not to go home tonight. He said he would explain everything, but I needed to trust him immediately. I stared at him, calculating my options. Before I could demand an explanation, he reached into his center console and pulled out an iPad. He unlocked the screen, adjusted the volume to maximum, and turned the device toward me. It was a video file. The angle was from this very same dashboard camera mounted above Daniel's rearview mirror facing inward. The timestamp in the corner indicated the recording was from 4 o'clock this afternoon. I watched the screen. 2 passengers were sitting exactly where I was sitting now. It was my son Matthew and his wife Rachel. Matthew was wearing the expensive Italian suit I had bought him for his promotion. Rachel was scrolling on her phone, laughing at something on the screen. The audio was crystal clear. Matthew leaned forward and told Rachel that the arrangements were finalized. He sounded incredibly bored, as if he were discussing a dinner reservation. He stated that the private psychiatric transport team had been paid in cash and would be waiting in my driveway at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Rachel did not look up from her phone. She simply asked if he was sure the team would not ask any questions. Matthew laughed. It was a cold, arrogant sound that I had never heard from my son before. He assured her that unlicensed extraction teams did not care about legalities as long as the check cleared. He laid out the entire plan. They had forged medical records claiming I had suffered a severe psychotic break following Catherine's death. They documented that I was highly agitated, delusional, and a severe suicidal danger to myself. The extraction team was instructed to forcefully enter my home, sedate me if I resisted, and transport me to a private, unlisted psychiatric facility across state lines for a mandatory 72-hour hold. Rachel finally looked up, smiling. She mentioned that once I was locked in a padded room and heavily medicated, obtaining a judge's signature to declare me legally incompetent would take less than a day. Matthew agreed. He patted her knee and said the house would be theirs by the weekend. The video ended. The screen faded to black. I sat in the back of the cold car, staring at my own reflection in the dark glass of the tablet. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel the heartbreaking sting of betrayal. What I felt was a sudden, absolute clarity. My children were not just disrespectful. They were predatory. They viewed my grief as a weakness and my life as an obstacle to their inheritance. I looked down at the glowing face of my wristwatch. It was 1:45 in the morning. If Daniel had driven me home, I would have walked through my front door in exactly 15 minutes. I would have been met by strangers with syringes and heavy canvas restraints. I would have been strapped to a gurney in the dark, screaming for help that would never come, ultimately proving their fabricated narrative of my insanity. I looked at Daniel. I asked him why he was doing this for me. He simply replied that a good man does not let another good man be led to the slaughter. Daniel put the car in drive. He told me I needed a safe place to formulate a plan. 10 minutes later, he pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a cheap cash-only motel on the very edge of the city limits. The neon sign buzzed erratically, casting harsh red light across the dirty windows. I handed Daniel a $100 bill from my wallet. He refused it. I told him to take it to buy a burner phone and to expect my call within 24 hours. He nodded, accepted the money, and drove away into the fog. I walked into the motel office, paid for a room with cash under a false name, and walked to room number 7. The air inside smelled of stale cigarette smoke and damp carpet. I did not turn on the lights. I walked straight to the sagging bed, sat on the edge, and pulled my mobile phone from my coat pocket. I opened the security application linked to my estate. I selected the camera mounted above the main garage. The live feed loaded instantly. The image was stark in the infrared night vision. A large, unmarked white van was parked directly in front of my iron gates. The gates had been manually overridden and forced open. I switched to the front porch camera. 2 large men in dark tactical clothing were standing by my massive oak door. One of them was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing bright white on the screen. The other man was casually swinging a heavy set of leather medical restraints from his right hand. I watched them for 5 minutes. I watched the smoke drift into the cold night air. My son was treating me like livestock to be captured and penned. My immediate instinct was to call the authorities. I opened my dial pad, but my thumb hovered over the screen. I stopped. Calling the police would trigger an immediate investigation. Matthew would simply present his forged medical documents to the officers. A psychiatric hold, once initiated by family members with seemingly legitimate medical concerns, is notoriously difficult to dismantle in the moment. The police might even assist the medical team, believing they were preventing a suicide. I would be trapped in a legal nightmare, fighting from a position of perceived insanity. I closed the security application. I needed to understand their motivation. Matthew was wealthy, but he was always greedy. Yet kidnapping his own father required a level of desperation I had not anticipated. I opened my primary banking application. I entered my password and pressed the biometric scanner. The screen flashed red. A stark message appeared stating that my access had been suspended due to executive administrative override. My accounts were locked. My credit lines were frozen. My entire financial foundation had been severed. I placed the phone on the cheap bedside table. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark for 6 hours, watching the shadows crawl across the peeling wallpaper, analyzing the structural integrity of my son's plan. He had moved fast. He had secured medical authority and financial control simultaneously. But like a poorly designed bridge, his plan relied on assumptions. He assumed I was a broken, grieving old man. He assumed I would be silenced by sunrise. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I walked out of the motel. The city was awake, the streets filled with commuters. I walked 2 miles to the nearest branch of my primary financial institution. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and ignored the long line of customers at the teller windows. I walked directly to the glass-walled office of the branch manager, a man named Henderson, whom I had known for 15 years. I opened his door without knocking. Henderson looked up from his computer, his face draining of color the moment he saw me. He stood up abruptly, stammering my name. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk. I told him to remain calm and explain exactly why I was locked out of my own life. Henderson swallowed hard. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick file folder. He pushed it across the polished mahogany desk with a trembling hand. He explained that Matthew had come into the main downtown branch yesterday afternoon. Matthew had presented a comprehensive medical power of attorney. The document declared me mentally unfit to manage my own affairs due to severe cognitive decline and emotional instability. It was signed by 2 private psychiatrists and stamped by a district judge. I opened the folder. The forgery was spectacular. It was a masterpiece of legal theft. Matthew had not just frozen my personal checking accounts. He had seized executive control of my primary holding company. I looked at Henderson. I asked him what Matthew intended to do with the holding company. Henderson wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked completely terrified, caught between a wealthy client and a legally binding court order. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. He confessed that Matthew and my daughter Sarah had scheduled an emergency executive board meeting for tomorrow morning at my former engineering firm. They had already drafted the preliminary contracts. They intended to bypass the board and use the power of attorney to unilaterally sell my entire portfolio of aerospace patents to a rival corporation. The patents were my life's work. They were the revolutionary structural designs I had developed over 3 decades, designs that currently kept thousands of commercial aircraft safely in the sky. They were worth tens of millions of dollars. My children were not just trying to steal my house. They were trying to liquidate my entire legacy for a massive immediate cash payout. I closed the folder. I did not yell. I did not threaten the bank manager. I simply stood up, adjusted my coat, and thanked him for his transparency. I walked out of the bank and into the bright, cold morning sun. The grief was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a cold, precise anger. They wanted to play a game of legal warfare. They had forgotten that I was the architect. The cold morning air hit my face the moment I stepped out of the bank, but I barely felt it. The bustling city sidewalks, the blaring taxi horns, and the rush of commuters all faded into a dull, distant hum. I walked away from the financial district with a measured, deliberate pace. I was not fleeing. I was calculating. My mind, trained for 4 decades to identify stress fractures and load-bearing vulnerabilities in massive steel structures, was now meticulously analyzing the architecture of my own destruction. My son Matthew and my daughter Sarah had engineered a flawless ambush. They had weaponized my grief over Catherine into a legal guillotine. By declaring me mentally incompetent, they had not merely stolen my money. They had erased my autonomy. They had legally pronounced me a ghost. I knew my mobile phone was no longer secure. If Matthew had the foresight to hire a black market psychiatric extraction team, He certainly had the resources to clone my digital footprint or track my location. I walked for 12 blocks until I reached a decaying, forgotten corner of the industrial district. Tucked between a boarded-up laundromat and a discount liquor store was a rusted coin-operated payphone. It was a relic of a bygone era, exactly what I needed. I pulled a handful of quarters from my coat pocket, fed them into the machine, and dialed a number I had committed to memory 20 years ago. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. It was Richard Caldwell. Richard was a man who had built an empire by tearing down other men in the courtroom. He was a corporate litigator of legendary ruthlessness, a man who viewed the law not as an instrument of justice, but as a weapon of mass financial destruction. He was currently semi-retired, spending his days on a sprawling equestrian estate, but I knew he would answer my call. 20 years ago, Richard was facing total professional ruin and a federal prison sentence. A rival development firm had framed his top client for a catastrophic structural collapse that killed 3 construction workers. Richard was being indicted for conspiracy and fraud. At immense personal risk to my own firm, I conducted a rogue forensic engineering audit of the collapsed site. I worked in the dead of night, pulling core samples from the twisted steel. I proved conclusively that the rival firm had secretly substituted commercial-grade iron for high-tensile steel to cut costs. My testimony exonerated Richard, destroyed his enemies, and secured his legacy. He had looked me in the eye on the courthouse steps and sworn a blood oath that if I ever needed a mountain moved, I only had to ask. I spoke my name into the cold plastic receiver. I told Richard that my foundation had been compromised from the inside. I told him I needed his mind, his resources, and his absolute discretion. Richard did not ask questions. He simply named a rundown diner on the edge of the city limits and told me he would be there in 30 minutes. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and old grease. I sat in a secluded corner booth facing the door. 10 minutes later, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot. Richard Caldwell stepped out. He was 70 years old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit carrying a battered leather briefcase. He slid into the vinyl booth opposite me, his sharp, predatory eyes scanning my face for any sign of the cognitive decline my children had documented. He found none. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I recounted the events of the previous night. I told him about the rideshare driver, the dashcam footage, the psychiatric extraction team waiting in my driveway, and the morning revelation at the bank. I laid out the stark reality that my children were 48 hours away from bypassing my corporate board and selling my entire portfolio of aerospace patents to a rival corporation. Richard listened in absolute silence. When I finished, he opened his briefcase and pulled out a sleek tablet. He had already used his high-level banking contacts to pull the digital copies of the power of attorney Matthew had filed. Richard placed his reading glasses on his nose and scrolled through the legal documents with clinical precision. I watched his eyes narrow as he analyzed the text. I asked him for his professional assessment. Richard sighed heavily, a sound of genuine professional admiration mixed with deep disgust. He placed the tablet face down on the sticky Formica table. He told me it was a masterpiece of legal forgery. Matthew had not taken any shortcuts. The psychiatric evaluations were highly detailed, utilizing standard industry terminology to describe profound grief morphing into dangerous psychosis. The signatures of the 2 private psychiatrists were real, belonging to doctors who were notorious for providing convenient diagnoses for exorbitant cash fees. The judicial stamp was authentic, heavily expedited by a corrupt notary public, whom Richard recognized immediately as a man who catered to the city's criminal elite. Richard leaned forward, clasping his hands together. He explained the brutal reality of the legal system. He said we could go to court. We could file an emergency injunction to halt the sale of the patents. We could demand independent psychiatric evaluations to prove my sanity. We could hire private investigators to trace the cash payments to the doctors and the notary. But then he delivered the fatal blow to that strategy. He told me the timeline was our enemy. The justice system moves like a glacier. Securing a hearing for an emergency injunction would take at least a week, perhaps two, given the heavily backlogged family court dockets. Matthew and Sarah had scheduled the emergency executive board meeting for tomorrow morning. They possessed legally binding court-approved authority over my estate right now. In 48 hours, the ink would be dry on the patent sale. The rival aerospace corporation would transfer tens of millions of dollars into an account controlled entirely by my children. Once the patents were sold to an innocent third-party corporation, retrieving them would be nearly impossible. Once the money was in Matthew and Sarah's hands, they would immediately launder it through offshore accounts to pay off their own hidden debts. By the time we proved my sanity in a courtroom 6 months from now, the wealth would be gone, the patents would be permanently lost, and my legacy would be completely erased. Richard took a slow sip of the terrible diner coffee. He looked at me with a cold, calculating intensity. He said we had to prepare for a long, ugly war of attrition. He promised he would bleed them dry in civil court for the rest of their natural lives. He promised he would make them suffer. I looked out the dirty window of the diner. The morning traffic was thickening, oblivious to the quiet destruction occurring in this booth. I thought about the sheer arrogance required to casually order a private kidnapping squad for your own father. I thought about Rachel sitting in the back of the car, scrolling through her phone, eagerly anticipating the acquisition of my home. They viewed me as a senile, toothless old man who would simply roll over and accept his fate. I turned my gaze back to Richard. I told him I had spent my entire life designing structures capable of withstanding hurricane-force winds and massive seismic shifts. I explained that when a building is deeply infected with structural rot, you do not try to patch the drywall. You do not try to reinforce a crumbling foundation with temporary braces. That only prolongs the inevitable collapse. When a structure is fatally compromised, the only correct engineering response is a controlled demolition. Richard stopped drinking his coffee. He placed the mug down very slowly. The seasoned corporate predator recognized a shift in the atmosphere. I told Richard I absolutely refused to fight my children in a courtroom. I refused to spend the next 5 years of my life begging a judge to restore the dignity that was inherently mine. I refused to play defense against two entitled parasites who believed they had outsmarted me. Defending myself meant validating their attack. It meant operating within the confines of the legal cage they had built around me. I leaned across the table, my voice dropping to a quiet, unbreakable register. I told Richard I did not want to block their punch. I wanted to build a trap. I wanted them to walk into the executive board meeting tomorrow morning, feeling absolute victory. I wanted them to sign the documents, shake hands with the corporate buyers, and believe they had conquered the world. And then at the precise moment of their highest triumph, I wanted the ground beneath them to vanish. I wanted to engineer a legal and financial vacuum that would swallow my children whole. I wanted them to be held personally, inescapably liable for their actions. I wanted them to lose everything they owned, everything they had ever built, and everything they thought they had stolen from me. A slow, chilling smile spread across Richard Caldwell's weathered face. It was the smile of a wolf who had just been invited to a slaughter. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and placed a gold fountain pen on the table. He looked at me, his eyes burning with renewed, ruthless energy. He asked me exactly how deep I wanted to dig the grave. I told him to dig it deep enough that they would never see the light of day again. By noon, Richard and I had relocated to a nondescript commercial building on the industrial west side of the city. Richard leased a vacant suite on the 4th floor under a blind corporate shell, name paying for a 6-month lease entirely in cash. It was a barren, echoing room with gray industrial carpet, bare white walls, and a single bank of frosted windows that overlooked the rain-slicked highway. This was our war room. It possessed no comforts, no distractions, and no warmth. It was a space designed purely for execution. Within an hour, Richard brought in 3 of his best forensic accountants. They were quiet, deeply focused individuals who wore sharp suits and carried heavy encrypted laptops. They treated financial records the way a homicide detective treats a crime scene. I provided them with every bank account number, social security detail, corporate tax identification, and property deed I possessed for my son and my daughter. I gave these strangers full authorization to tear my family's financial history apart and expose every hidden fracture. I sat at a cheap folding table by the window, watching the relentless rain streak the glass. I waited in absolute silence for the autopsy of my children's lives to be completed. I had spent the last 30 years believing my children were highly successful professionals. I had paid for their elite university educations out of my own pocket. I had gifted them the massive down payments for their lavish suburban homes. I had always assumed their apparent wealth was the natural result of their hard work and the sturdy foundation I had provided. I was about to learn that their entire existence was a carefully constructed, desperately fragile illusion. Late in the afternoon, the lead accountant closed his laptop, stood up, and handed me a thick, printed dossier. He did not offer any sympathetic platitudes. He did not look me in the eye. He simply stated that my son was not a successful real estate developer. He told me that Matthew was a criminal drowning in a spectacular amount of debt, and his entire life was a house of cards waiting for a strong wind. I opened the heavy file. The columns of numbers and highlighted bank statements told a story of staggering arrogance and profound stupidity. Matthew had been secretly siphoning funds from his firm's commercial escrow accounts for the past 3 years. He had embezzled nearly $4 million of his clients' money to fund a lifestyle he absolutely could not afford. The accountants had tracked the stolen money. Matthew used it to buy exotic sports cars, to charter private jets for expensive tropical vacations with Rachel, and to purchase a sprawling second vacation home in the mountains. He used the protected escrow money of innocent families to pay for his own unchecked vanity. But the real estate market had recently cooled, and his firm was scheduled for a comprehensive external audit by the State Regulatory Board at the end of this month. When those state auditors opened the company books, they would instantly discover the missing millions. The digital trail of his theft was undeniable. Matthew was not just facing public bankruptcy and the loss of his business license. He was facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I stared at the pages, feeling a cold weight settle in my chest. The forged power of attorney and the terrifying midnight kidnapping plot were not born of simple, lazy greed. They were acts of absolute, unhinged desperation. He desperately needed to sell my aerospace patents because liquidating my life's work was the only possible way to replace the stolen escrow funds before the state auditors arrived. He was entirely willing to lock his own father in a heavily medicated psychiatric ward to save himself from a prison cell. He viewed my sanity and my freedom as an acceptable casualty for his survival. I turned the page of the dossier. The forensic accountants had also completely dismantled the financial life of my daughter Sarah and her husband Bradley. Sarah had always played the role of the perfect affluent suburban mother. She hosted expensive charity dinners, drove luxury SUVs, and managed a pristine public image on social media. But the financial records revealed a terrifying darkness lurking beneath her manicured life. Bradley was a degenerate gambler. He had not just lost their personal savings at the local casinos or on casual sports betting applications. He had ventured deep into the dangerous underworld of illegal sports betting syndicates. The accountants traced massive irregular cash withdrawals and the desperate liquidation of their retirement accounts. They uncovered a trail of panicked loans taken out against their primary residence with predatory unlisted financial institutions. But the most chilling discovery was a series of intercepted communications pulled from Bradley's phone records and offshore transfer attempts. He was currently indebted for over $2 million to an organized crime syndicate operating out of a neighboring state. The loan sharks had completely lost their patience. They had given him a strict deadline. The messages contained explicit graphic threats against Sarah, their home, and their physical safety if the debt was not settled by the end of the week. Sarah knew absolutely everything. She was fully complicit in the plan to steal my patents. She was willing to sacrifice my entire legacy to pay off the violent men her weak husband had enraged. My children were not merely entitled parasites waiting for their inheritance. They were cornered animals terrified of the consequences of their own actions and totally willing to tear me apart to survive. I closed the dossier and slid it back across the folding table. Richard Caldwell watched me from across the room. He walked over, poured 2 glasses of water from a plastic pitcher, and handed me one. He asked me if I was surprised by the magnitude of their betrayal. I took a slow drink of the water. I told him I was not surprised by the betrayal itself, but I was deeply offended by their incredible sloppiness. I had built a long, successful career on the concept of precision. I had designed massive steel structures where a single millimeter of miscalculation could result in a catastrophic failure and the loss of thousands of lives. I taught my children the value of a strong foundation. But Matthew and Sarah had built their adult lives on a foundation of lies and theft. They assumed they could simply steal my life's work to patch the gaping, fatal holes in their own existence. They believed the forged medical documents gave them absolute, unquestionable authority to execute the sale of my aerospace patents tomorrow morning. They believed they had effectively neutralized me. They thought they had outsmarted the old engineer by using the legal system as a weapon against him. But they possessed a fatal misunderstanding of how my corporate assets were actually secured. When I established the patent charter 30 years ago, I recognized the immense value of my designs. I anticipated the very real possibility of corporate espionage, hostile takeovers, or digital theft. I engineered a fail-safe mechanism that no piece of paper, no forged signature, and no corrupt judge could ever override. The digital files containing the final aerospace blueprints they intended to sell to the rival corporation were heavily encrypted. The decryption sequence could only be accessed via a physical master drive. That drive was secured inside a specialized biometric safety deposit box in the deepest main vault of my primary bank. The forged power of attorney might grant them the legal authority to sit in a boardroom and sign preliminary contracts. It might convince a bank manager to freeze my personal checking accounts. But a piece of paper could not bypass the physical security protocols of the biometric vault. Opening that specific box required my physical presence. It required the precise scan of my right retina and the direct pressure of my thumbprint on the scanning glass. There was no manual override, and the bank manager did not possess a master key. Matthew did not know about the biometric requirement. He had only ever seen the standard corporate charters. He believed he could just walk into the bank tomorrow morning, present the forged power of attorney, demand the physical master drive, and collect the millions from the rival corporation. He was completely unaware that tomorrow morning he was going to collide with an immovable brick wall of my own design. The trap was perfectly set. They had the motive, they had the forged authority, and they were racing toward the finish line, completely blinded by their own desperation. Now Richard and I only had to wait for them to walk blindly into the steel jaws. I sat across from Richard Caldwell in the dim light of our makeshift war room. The rain continued to batter the frosted glass windows. It was a fitting backdrop to the silent storm I was currently unleashing upon my own family. I asked Richard to pull up the original founding charter of Stanton Engineering Solutions on his encrypted laptop. I had drafted this document exactly 30 years ago when my firm was nothing more than a rented desk and a head full of mathematical theories. Richard typed rapidly on his keyboard and retrieved the archived legal files. I told him to scroll down to section 12 and read subsection 4 aloud. It was a specific paragraph buried deep within the corporate bylaws. I had written it long before my children had ever shown a single hint of greed or entitlement. I had engineered that specific clause not to protect myself from my family, but to protect my life work from hostile corporate takeovers or malicious competitors. The clause explicitly stated that in the event I was ever declared medically incompetent or cognitively compromised by any external medical professional all external powers of attorney would be immediately rendered entirely null and void regarding the disposition of the company intellectual property. Richard read the clause slowly. His voice dropped an octave as he fully realized the sheer architectural brilliance of the trap. He looked up from the screen with a wide grin. By utilizing forged psychiatric evaluations to declare me legally incompetent, Matthew and Sarah had unknowingly triggered the exact defensive mechanism designed to strip them of their assumed power. Their forged power of attorney was worse than useless. It was the very key that locked them completely out of the system. I instructed Richard to activate the medical incapacitation clause immediately. I did not want to merely block their access to my wealth. I wanted to completely remove the prize from the board while they were still running the race. I told him to draft the necessary paperwork to establish a massive, irrevocable charitable trust. Richard paused his typing. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He asked me who the sole beneficiary of this new trust would be. I did not have to think about my answer. I thought about my late wife. I thought of the long, terrible nights in the Metropolitan Medical Center, holding Catherine by her frail hand as the machines hummed and the aggressive cancer slowly stole her away from me. I thought of the incredible nurses and the exhausted doctors who treated her with profound dignity when the end finally came. I thought of my own sleepless nights wandering those hospital halls as a volunteer finding a strange, quiet peace among the suffering of others. I told Richard that every single patent I had ever designed, every dollar of liquid capital in my accounts, and the deed to my massive suburban estate were to be transferred immediately to the William Stanton Memorial Foundation. It was a newly formed legal entity whose sole beneficiary was the Metropolitan Medical Center, where my wife had taken her last breath. We spent the next 6 hours executing the silent adjustment. Richard brought a specialized corporate notary to our war room. She was a woman of unquestionable legal integrity who thoroughly verified my absolute lucidity and my cognitive sharpness before I was allowed to sign a single document. I picked up the heavy gold pen and I signed over the exclusive rights to my revolutionary aerospace designs. I watched the screen as Richard and his team of forensic accountants electronically wired tens of millions of dollars from my personal checking accounts and my corporate investment portfolios directly into the impenetrable legal fortress of the charitable trust. I signed away the massive house I had built with my own hands. I gave away the home where my children had taken their first steps, the very home they were currently trying to steal from me by locking me in a psychiatric ward. With each stroke of my pen, I felt the heavy burden of my wealth lifting from my shoulders. I was stripping away the money that had deeply poisoned my family. I was transforming my financial success into a permanent legacy of healing. I was ensuring that my life work would save the lives of sick children rather than fund my son and his criminal negligence or pay off my son-in-law and his violent gambling debts. Richard warned me one final time before I signed the ultimate transfer deed. He explained the absolute legal finality of an irrevocable trust. Once the assets were transferred into the foundation, I could never legally take them back. I could not change my mind tomorrow morning or 10 years from now. I would be effectively disinheriting myself along with my children. I would be leaving myself with nothing but my standard retirement pension. I looked at the seasoned corporate litigator and smiled. I told him I was a man of very simple needs. I had my sharp mind, I had my physical health, and I had my absolute freedom. That was all I required to survive the rest of my days. I pressed the pen to the heavy parchment paper and finalized the massive transfer. In a matter of hours, I had legally given away a massive fortune without making a single sound. But simply taking the money away from them was not enough. The architectural integrity of my revenge required a devastating counterweight. Matthew and Sarah had to be severely punished for their staggering hubris. They needed to experience the full, terrifying consequences of trying to destroy their own father. I told Richard to leave my original corporate holding company perfectly intact. Stanton Engineering Holdings was to remain as a fully registered corporate entity with the state. However, it was now an entirely empty shell. Every valuable asset, every patent, and every dollar had been quietly drained through the back door. I left behind a beautifully painted corporate facade with absolutely nothing inside. But in the corporate legal system, an empty shell corporation can still hold massive debt. It can still hold infinite liability. I instructed Richard to draft a final lethal addendum to the empty holding company operational charter. I used my final moments as the undisputed executive officer of the corporation to legally bind the company liabilities to anyone who actively claimed executive control over it. By presenting their forged medical power of attorney to the bank tomorrow morning, Matthew and Sarah were legally seizing full administrative control of the holding company. They deeply believed they were seizing my valuable assets. They were actually assuming total personal and inescapable responsibility for the company actions and debts. Richard and I carefully reviewed the preliminary corporate contracts that Matthew and Sarah had already signed with the rival aerospace corporation earlier that week. My children had boldly accepted a $5 million non-refundable advance deposit from the corporate buyers. They used their forged documents to guarantee the immediate delivery of my physical patent blueprints to the buyers tomorrow morning. Richard and his brilliant accountants had already tracked exactly where that $5 million went. The very moment the massive deposit hit Matthew and his fraudulent account, he had frantically wired $3 million directly into his real estate firm escrow accounts to completely cover his tracks and hide his embezzlement from the state auditors. He had then wired the remaining $2 million to the untraceable offshore accounts of the violent gambling syndicate to save his brother-in-law from being murdered. The $5 million advance money was completely gone. Tomorrow morning, my son and my daughter would proudly walk into the bank downtown. They would confidently expect to open my biometric vault, extract the master drives, and finalize the sale of aerospace patents they no longer legally owned. When the biometric vault remained permanently sealed against their forged papers, they would instantly be in severe breach of contract with a massive, highly aggressive aerospace corporation. That angry corporation would immediately sue my empty holding company for massive corporate fraud and demand the immediate return of their $5 million. Because the holding company was now completely empty, and because Matthew and Sarah had legally assumed all executive liabilities through their own forged power of attorney, the massive lawsuit would easily pierce the corporate veil. The legal strike would bypass the company entirely and hit my children directly. They would be personally, legally, and inescapably responsible for paying back $5 million they had already spent. I had not just quietly removed their unearned inheritance. I had meticulously engineered a financial black hole that would rapidly consume their expensive homes, their luxury cars, their personal freedom, and their entire future. I leaned back in my cheap folding chair, looked at Richard, and listened to the rain hitting the glass. The silent adjustment was complete, and the landmine was perfectly armed. For 3 days, I did not leave the 4th-floor suite of the industrial commercial building. Richard Caldwell arranged for a cot, fresh clothes, and simple meals to be delivered. The war room became my entire world. I sat in the dim light of the computer monitors, watching the digital feeds and news broadcasts, observing my children frantically trying to control a narrative that was rapidly unraveling. The private psychiatric extraction team had arrived at my estate exactly at 2 o'clock in the morning, just as Matthew had planned. But they found an empty house. My security cameras recorded them breaching the front door, searching the empty rooms, and eventually leaving in frustrated confusion. When Matthew received the call that his prey had escaped, his carefully constructed plan began to crack. By the next morning, the local news channels were broadcasting my face across the city. Matthew and Sarah had gone directly to the police station to file an emergency missing persons report. They did not do this out of genuine concern. They did it to establish a public documented timeline of my supposed mental collapse. I watched my son stand on the steps of the municipal police precinct, surrounded by reporters holding microphones. Sarah stood beside him, clutching a tissue, playing the role of the terrified, heartbroken daughter to absolute perfection. Matthew stared directly into the television cameras and delivered an award-winning performance. He told the public that I was suffering from severe, rapid-onset dementia triggered by the recent loss of my wife. He claimed I was heavily medicated, deeply confused, and a severe danger to myself. He begged anyone with information to contact the authorities immediately, so his beloved father could be brought home to receive the urgent psychiatric care he so desperately needed. It was a brilliant, disgusting piece of theater. By broadcasting my alleged insanity to the entire city, he believed he was solidifying the legitimacy of his forged medical power of attorney. He was completely unaware that every tear he shed on television was simply adding another layer of concrete to his own legal tomb. But the media charade could not pause the relentless ticking of their financial clocks. The state regulatory auditors were still scheduled to examine Matthew and his real estate firm. The violent loan sharks were still demanding their $2 million from Bradley and Sarah. The pressure was suffocating them. Even with their father missing and the police actively searching the city, my children could not afford to delay the corporate buyout. They were arrogant enough to believe that their forged documents would shield them from any scrutiny. They assumed the rival aerospace corporation would simply ignore a missing persons report if the intellectual property was valuable enough. Richard utilized his extensive network of corporate informants to monitor the exact movements of my children. On Thursday afternoon, while police cruisers were actively patrolling my suburban neighborhood looking for my body, Matthew and Sarah confidently walked into the glass high-rise headquarters of the rival aerospace corporation. They were dressed in immaculate tailored suits, projecting an aura of absolute executive authority. They sat across a polished granite boardroom table from a team of highly aggressive corporate acquisition lawyers. The rival executives were initially hesitant. Acquiring tens of millions of dollars in patents from a company whose founder had mysteriously vanished just hours prior was a massive liability. But Matthew was a master manipulator. He deployed his charm and his forged documents with lethal precision. He presented the heavy stack of fake psychiatric evaluations. He presented the court-stamped medical power of attorney. He assured the rival executives that my disappearance was simply a tragic personal matter, a final symptom of a grieving old man, and that it had absolutely no bearing on the legal operations of Stanton Engineering Holdings. He claimed that the board of directors had unanimously appointed him as the acting chief executive officer to stabilize the company during this difficult family transition. The rival corporation wanted my revolutionary designs desperately. Their own engineering department was years behind my technology. Greed ultimately blinded their legal team. They accepted Matthew and his fabricated narrative. They pushed the preliminary acquisition contracts across the granite table. Matthew and Sarah did not hesitate. They eagerly signed the heavy stack of documents officially committing Stanton Engineering Holdings to the permanent transfer of my life work. In exchange for their signatures, the rival corporation authorized the immediate release of a $5 million non-refundable advance deposit. It was a massive sum of money designed to secure the exclusive rights to the blueprints until the final physical transfer could be completed. Back in the war room, Richard and I watched the financial monitors glow with the incoming data. We had full administrative access to the empty shell of my holding company. We watched the massive corporate wire transfer hit the holding company account. For exactly 30 seconds, the account displayed a balance of $5 million. Then the panic of my children took over. They did not leave the money in the corporate account to be properly managed or taxed. They immediately initiated 2 massive outbound wire transfers. I watched the digital numbers drain from the screen in real time. $3 million vanished, routed through a complex series of shell accounts, before finally landing in the escrow accounts of Matthew and his failing real estate firm. He had successfully replaced the money he had embezzled from his clients. The state auditors would find perfectly balanced books. He believed he had just saved himself from a federal prison sentence. A second wire transfer of $2 million executed moments later. The forensic accountants traced the funds bouncing through 3 different international routing numbers before settling into the untraceable offshore accounts controlled by the illegal gambling syndicate. Bradley and his violent debts were instantly erased. Sarah believed she had just saved her family from physical destruction. My children walked out of the corporate high-rise that afternoon, feeling completely invincible. They had successfully navigated a massive legal minefield. They had utilized the legal system to strip their father of his autonomy. They had sold his legacy to the highest bidder, and they had instantly cured their own catastrophic financial failures. They believed they were brilliant strategists who had flawlessly executed the perfect crime, but their victory was entirely built on the assumption that they possessed the actual product they had just sold. The rival aerospace corporation had paid $5 million for the exclusive rights to my structural blueprints. The contract explicitly stated that the physical master drives containing those heavily encrypted blueprints had to be delivered to their legal team by Friday morning. If the drives were not delivered, the contract would be immediately voided, and the $5 million advance would be subject to immediate aggressive legal reclamation. Matthew was not worried about the delivery. He possessed the forged power of attorney. He possessed the judicial stamp. He fully believed he could simply walk into my primary bank branch on Friday morning, present the documents to the frightened branch manager, and demand the contents of my secure vault. He had no idea that a piece of forged paper was entirely useless against a retinal scanner and a biometric lock. Late Thursday evening, while Matthew and Sarah were celebrating their false victory with expensive champagne in a downtown restaurant, the final piece of the trap clicked into place. My children were acting as the legal executives of my estate. Therefore, they received all automated correspondence linked to my banking profiles. At exactly 8 o'clock at night, an automated email and a secure text message were simultaneously dispatched to Matthew and his mobile phone. I knew exactly what the message said because I had instructed Richard to schedule it. The notification informed the acting executives of Stanton Engineering Holdings that the primary biometric safety deposit box located in the downtown central vault had been successfully scheduled for authorized access at 9 o'clock the following morning. I could only imagine the smug satisfaction on my son's face when he read that alert. He likely assumed that his aggressive tactics had completely intimidated the banking institution. He probably believed the bank manager had preemptively bypassed the security protocols to accommodate the court order and avoid a legal confrontation with the new chief executive officer. Matthew and Sarah went to sleep that night, convinced that the war was over. They believed they had completely conquered my legacy and secured their own futures. They had no idea that the automated bank alert was not a confirmation of their victory. It was a formal invitation to their execution. The trap waiting at the bank vault was perfect, but it was only one half of the execution. When Matthew and Sarah failed to produce the physical master drives tomorrow morning, they would technically be in breach of their preliminary contracts. However, corporate bureaucracies are notoriously slow. The rival aerospace corporation might give them a grace period. They might allow my children time to fabricate another lie, forge another document, or attempt to flee the jurisdiction entirely. I could not allow them any time to breathe. The moment the vault refused to open, the rival corporation needed to instantly realize they had been defrauded of $5 million. They needed to immediately drop the legal hammer on my children before Matthew and Sarah even had the chance to leave the bank lobby. To achieve this simultaneous destruction, the rival corporation's general counsel needed to receive a specific legal dossier at the exact minute my children walked into the bank. This dossier contained the absolute proof of their fraud. It held the certified copies of my irrevocable charitable trust, the time-stamped transfer of the aerospace patents, and the newly amended bylaws of the empty holding company. It was a package composed of pure financial anthrax. But I could not deliver this dossier myself. I was still legally a missing person, and walking into a corporate lobby would trigger an immediate police response. Richard Caldwell was far too recognizable in the legal community. If the rival lawyers saw his face, they would immediately raise their defenses and lock down their communications. I needed a ghost. I needed someone completely invisible to the corporate world, yet intelligent enough to bypass high-level security and force the documents directly into the hands of the executive legal team. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the cheap burner phone I had purchased days ago. I dialed the single number I had saved in its memory. Daniel answered on the first ring. His voice was quiet and alert. I told him I required his assistance one final time. I gave him the address of a deserted public park located halfway between my war room and the downtown financial district. I told him to meet me there in exactly 1 hour. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city air smelling of wet asphalt and cold exhaust. I sat on a damp wooden bench beneath the heavy shadow of an ancient oak tree. At precisely midnight, Daniel walked down the paved path. He was wearing a dark, worn winter coat. He looked exhausted, carrying the heavy burden of chronic sleep deprivation, but his eyes were remarkably sharp. He sat down on the opposite end of the bench and waited for me to speak. I looked at him. I had trusted this young man with my freedom, and he had delivered me from the jaws of a heavily medicated prison. I asked him a simple question. I asked him why a man with his obvious intelligence and sharp instincts was driving a rideshare vehicle at 1 o'clock in the morning. Daniel looked out over the dark, empty park. He did not ask for pity. He simply stated the facts of his existence. He told me he was in his final year of law school, ranking at the very top of his class. He was brilliant, driven, and desperate. 3 years ago, his infant daughter was born with a severe, highly complex congenital heart defect. The multiple open heart surgeries had saved her fragile life, but the astronomical medical bills had completely destroyed his family finances. His health insurance had aggressively denied the most critical procedures, classifying them as experimental. To keep his little girl breathing, Daniel had taken on hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt. He drove the rideshare vehicle all night to keep the aggressive collection agencies from seizing his meager bank accounts, and he studied the law all day to secure a better future. He was a man slowly drowning in the brutal reality fuck of the American healthcare system, yet he was fighting with every ounce of his strength to protect the people he loved. I listened to his story in absolute silence. I thought about my son Matthew, who had stolen millions of dollars from innocent families just to buy a vacation home in the mountains. I thought about my daughter Sarah, who had married a weak, violent gambler and was willing to sacrifice my life to pay off his criminal debts. And then I looked at Daniel, a stranger, who had risked his own safety to protect an old man simply because it was the right thing to do. The contrast was staggering. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I placed it on the wooden bench between us. I told Daniel that tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, my children would walk into the downtown bank branch to finalize the theft of my legacy. I explained that I needed this envelope hand-delivered to the general counsel of the rival aerospace corporation at that precise moment. I warned him that the corporate headquarters was a fortress. The receptionists were highly trained to turn away unannounced couriers, and the security guards would forcefully remove anyone who caused a disturbance. I told Daniel I needed someone who understood the precise language of the law. I needed someone who could confidently walk into that lobby, look the head of security in the eye, and legally compel them to deliver the documents to the top floor immediately. Daniel looked at the heavy envelope. He understood exactly what I was asking him to do. He was being asked to carry the detonator into the heart of a hostile corporate environment. If he failed, the timing of my trap would be ruined. My children might find a way to escape the immediate financial consequences of their actions. Daniel did not hesitate. He reached across the damp wood and picked up the envelope. He slid it inside his dark coat. He told me he knew exactly how to bypass the front desk. He explained that a courier can be ignored, but a legal clerk serving formal notice of corporate fraud cannot be legally delayed without the corporation assuming massive liability. He promised me the general counsel would have the dossier in his hands before the clock struck 1 minute past 9. I asked him what he wanted in return for this massive risk. He was a man drowning in debt. He could have easily demanded $10,000, and I would have gladly paid it. Daniel shook his head. He looked at me with a quiet, fierce dignity. He said he did not want my money. He said he had watched the news broadcasts. He had seen Matthew weeping fake tears on television playing the victim while actively trying to destroy his own father. Daniel told me he just wanted to watch the arrogant and the cruel finally face the consequences of their actions. He stood up, gave me a brief nod, and walked away into the dark park. I remained on the bench for a long time. I was deeply moved by his integrity. When I finally returned to the fourth-floor war room, Richard Caldwell was still awake reviewing the final injunction parameters on his encrypted laptop. I took off my wet coat and sat down across from him. I told Richard that our delivery mechanism was perfectly secured. Then I gave Richard a new directive. I told him to access the massive financial reserves of the newly established William Stanton Memorial Foundation. The foundation was designed to assist the Metropolitan Medical Center, to fund vital research, and to alleviate the suffering of those trapped in the medical system. I had Richard access the hospital administrative databases using his high-level contacts. It took him less than 20 minutes to locate the massive crippling accounts linked to Daniel and his young daughter. I watched the screen as Richard pulled up the total balance. It was a staggering number, a mountain of debt that would have kept Daniel working himself into an early grave for the next 20 years. I gave Richard the authorization code. I instructed him to wire the exact amount from the charitable trust directly to the hospital billing department. We paid it off anonymously, utilizing a secure legal routing number that could never be traced back to me. In a matter of seconds, the digital balance dropped to absolute zero. The crushing weight that had been destroying Daniel's life simply vanished. I knew he would not discover the miraculous payment until the hospital billing department sent him an automated confirmation email in the morning. By the time he realized his daughter was entirely debt-free, he would already be walking into the corporate headquarters to deliver my vengeance. I did not pay off his debt to buy his loyalty. His loyalty had already been proven the night he locked his car doors and drove me away from my kidnappers. I paid off his debt because true power is not just the ability to destroy your enemies. True power is the ability to quietly, profoundly change the life of a good man. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday. In exactly 6 hours, the sun would rise over the city. Matthew and Sarah would wake up in their expensive suburban homes, put on their finest tailored suits, and drive downtown to claim a fortune that no longer existed. They would walk into the bank completely blind to the fact that a rideshare driver was simultaneously walking into a corporate high-rise across town, carrying the legal paperwork that would end their privileged lives forever. The chessboard was perfectly arranged. The final pieces were locked into their designated positions. I had stripped away their inheritance. I had weaponized their own greed against them. I had bound them to massive, inescapable corporate debt. All that remained was for me to step out of the shadows and watch them pull the trigger on themselves. I would later learn exactly how my children spent their final moments of perceived victory from the detailed testimonies of the bank staff and the internal security footage I requisitioned. Friday morning broke over the financial district with a brilliant cold sunlight that reflected sharply off the glass towers. Matthew and Sarah arrived at the main branch of the First National Bank at exactly 8:45 in the morning. They did not arrive looking like grieving children desperate to find their missing father. They arrived looking like conquering royalty. Matthew wore a bespoke navy blue suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. Sarah was dressed in pristine white cashmere, carrying a designer handbag that signaled absolute financial security. They were flanked by their spouses Rachel and Bradley, who walked with the frantic, relieved energy of people who had just narrowly escaped the guillotine. They bypassed the long lines of regular customers in the main lobby. They did not speak to the standard tellers. Matthew demanded immediate access to the VIP executive conference room on the third floor, citing his newly established authority as the acting chief executive officer of Stanton Engineering Holdings. The bank staff, thoroughly intimidated by the aggressive legal documents Matthew had filed the previous day, quickly escorted them to the private suite. The executive conference room was a monument to institutional wealth. It featured heavy mahogany wall paneling, deep leather chairs, and a massive granite table that dominated the center of the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city skyline. Matthew immediately took the seat at the head of the table. He was claiming my throne before my body was even cold in the ground. He ordered the nervous bank assistant to bring them a bottle of the finest vintage champagne the bank kept reserved for its top-tier clients. At 9:05, the assistant returned with a silver ice bucket, a dark green bottle, and 4 crystal flutes. Matthew popped the cork with a loud celebratory crack that echoed off the mahogany walls. He poured the sparkling wine and raised his glass. He proposed a toast to the future, completely ignoring the fact that his future was built on the fabricated insanity of his own father. Sarah smiled warmly and clinked her glass against his. Rachel immediately pulled out her mobile phone and began scrolling through exclusive real estate listings for a third vacation property. Bradley simply drank his champagne in one massive gulp, his hands still trembling slightly from the residual adrenaline of paying off his violent loan sharks the day before. They sat in that luxurious room drinking expensive wine completely insulated by their own staggering arrogance. They believed the hard part was entirely over. They assumed the bank manager Henderson was currently down in the subterranean vault, utilizing a heavy industrial drill to break open my biometric safety deposit box. They expected Henderson to walk through the heavy oak doors at any moment, carrying a silver tray holding the encrypted master drives. They had the forged power of attorney resting on the granite table, a physical shield they believed made them entirely untouchable by the law or by morality. The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room chimed 9 o'clock. The sound was deep and resonant. Matthew checked his heavy gold wristwatch, nodding in satisfaction. He told the room that the courier from the rival aerospace corporation would be waiting in the downstairs lobby in exactly 30 minutes to take possession of the drives. 10 minutes passed. The champagne bottle was half empty. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut. At 9:15, the celebratory atmosphere began to subtly curdle. Matthew tapped his fingers aggressively against the polished granite. He hated waiting. He viewed any delay as a direct insult to his newly acquired authority. Sarah tried to soothe him, suggesting that drilling a high-security biometric lock simply took time. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his eyes darting toward the door. The silence in the room stretched tight, amplifying the sound of the ticking clock. At 9:20, Matthew stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, his face flushed with sudden irritation. He announced that he was going down to the vault himself to fire whoever was taking so long. He grabbed the forged power of attorney from the table and marched toward the exit. Before his hand could touch the brass handle, the heavy doors swung inward. Henderson, the branch manager, stepped into the room. The collective relief of my children lasted for exactly 1 second. Henderson was not pushing a secure transport cart. He was not holding a silver tray. He was empty-handed. Furthermore, he looked completely terrified. His face was entirely drained of color, his breathing was shallow and rapid, and dark patches of sweat stained the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He looked like a man who had just looked directly into the barrel of a loaded weapon. Matthew stopped in his tracks. His arrogant sneer deepened into a scowl of pure rage. He demanded to know where the master drives were. He reminded Henderson that he possessed a court-ordered medical power of attorney and that any further delay would result in the immediate termination of Henderson's career and a massive civil lawsuit against the bank. Henderson did not apologize. He did not stammer. Fear had pushed him past the point of corporate politeness. He looked directly at Matthew and stated clearly that the vault could not be opened. Sarah stood up, her white cashmere suddenly looking less like armor and more like a shroud. She asked Henderson what he meant by that statement. She told him to call a locksmith, to call a safe cracker, to do whatever was necessary to break the metal box open immediately. Henderson shook his head slowly. He stepped further into the room, putting distance between himself and the open doorway. He explained the brutal reality of the banking infrastructure. He told them that the specific safety deposit box, holding the aerospace patents, was a military-grade biometric vault. It was not secured by a traditional key or a simple combination dial. It possessed a titanium core that was designed to completely incinerate the contents of the box if it detected any unauthorized thermal or kinetic breaching attempts. If they took an industrial drill to that lock, the friction would trigger a chemical reaction that would instantly burn the master drives to ashes. Matthew slammed his hand down on the granite table. The crystal champagne flutes rattled violently. He screamed that he was the legal executive of the estate. He screamed that the bank had a legal obligation to provide a manual override. He shoved the forged power of attorney directly into Henderson's chest. Henderson let the thick legal document fall to the floor. He looked at my son with a mixture of pity and absolute dread. He informed Matthew that a manual override was physically impossible. The biometric scanner required the active thermal signature, the precise retinal mapping, and the live thumbprint of the original account holder. It required William Stanton in the flesh to open the door. Rachel dropped her phone on the table. Bradley sank back into his chair, the color leaving his face. The reality of the situation was finally piercing their arrogance. Without my physical presence, they could not access the blueprints. Without the blueprints, they could not fulfill the contract with the rival aerospace corporation. And they had already spent the $5 million advance. Matthew refused to accept defeat. He was a cornered predator acting on pure aggressive instinct. He grabbed Henderson by the lapels of his suit jacket. He told the bank manager that William Stanton was completely insane and currently a missing person. He demanded that the bank's Central Security Division bypass the thermal sensors, immediately threatening to burn the entire institution to the ground using his lawyers. Henderson gently but firmly removed Matthew's hands from his clothing. He took a deep breath. He told Matthew that even if they could magically open the box, it would not matter. He explained that exactly 5 minutes ago, the legal department of the First National Bank received a sweeping, unbreakable federal injunction. The injunction explicitly froze all interaction with the corporate entity known as Stanton Engineering Holdings. Sarah practically screamed, demanding to know who authorized a federal injunction against their company. Henderson looked past them. He looked toward the open doorway. He said the injunction was authorized by the actual owner of the estate. The heavy oak doors of the executive conference room swung wide open, hitting the mahogany walls with a sound like a thunderclap. I walked into the room. I did not look like a grieving, confused old man wandering the streets. I did not look like a fragile victim waiting to be sedated and locked in a padded room. I wore a flawless charcoal gray tailored suit. My posture was perfectly straight, forged by decades of walking massive steel construction sites. My mind was sharper than it had been in years, entirely focused on the absolute destruction of the parasites standing before me. I was terrifyingly calm. I was not alone. Richard Caldwell walked directly to my right, carrying his battered leather briefcase, his eyes scanning my children with the cold, hungry anticipation of a wolf cornering sick prey. To my left and right, stepping into the room with heavy authoritative strides, were 2 fully armed United States federal marshals. They wore dark tactical suits, their badges gleaming under the recessed lighting of the conference room. They took up defensive positions on either side of the doorway, effectively sealing the exit. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vacuum. Matthew stood frozen at the head of the table. His mouth was slightly open. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to paralyze his lungs. He was looking at a ghost who had suddenly manifested to drag him down to hell. Sarah pressed her hands over her mouth, stumbling backward, until her legs hit a leather chair. She collapsed into it, staring at me as if my very presence violated the laws of physics. She had watched me weep at her mother's funeral. She had watched me sit quietly in the garden for months. She had entirely convinced herself that I was weak. The reality of my strength was currently short-circuiting her brain. Bradley looked quickly toward the windows, his eyes darting frantically, as if calculating the survivability of a 3-story drop to the pavement. Rachel remained entirely motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the granite table so tightly her knuckles were stark white. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. The only sound was the steady rhythmic clicking of my leather dress shoes against the polished hardwood floor. I stopped at the opposite end of the massive granite table directly facing my son. I looked at the crystal flutes. I looked at the silver ice bucket. I looked at the forged medical power of attorney lying discarded on the floor like a piece of common trash. I finally broke the silence. My voice was low, perfectly controlled, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I looked directly into Matthew's terrified eyes. I asked him if he honestly believed I would allow my own blood to treat me like a wounded animal. I asked him if he really thought a forged signature and an unlicensed transport van in the middle of the night were enough to conquer a man who had spent his entire life building indestructible foundations. Matthew tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, breathless wheeze escaped his throat. The master manipulator, the man who had confidently lied to national television cameras just 24 hours ago, was completely broken by the simple reality of my presence. I reached out and picked up the half-empty bottle of vintage champagne from the table. I inspected the green glass for a moment. Then I turned the bottle upside down and poured the expensive wine directly onto the polished granite. The liquid splashed over the table, dripping down the edges and staining the luxurious carpet below. I set the empty bottle down with a heavy thud. I told them the celebration was officially over. I pulled out the chair at my end of the table and sat down. I looked at Richard Caldwell and gave him a single nod. It was time to execute the final phase of the silent adjustment. It was time to show them exactly how deep the grave they had dug for themselves truly was. The absolute silence in the executive conference room was broken by the frantic, desperate survival instincts of my son. Matthew possessed the terrifying ability of a true sociopath to pivot from complete shock to manufactured empathy in the span of a single heartbeat. The color rushed back into his face. He forced his features into a mask of profound, overwhelming relief. He let out a loud, theatrical breath and took a step toward me. He threw his arms wide open, playing the role of the terrified child who had finally found his lost, mentally fragile father. He cried out my name, telling me how deeply worried they had all been, claiming they had the entire city searching for me. He intended to embrace me, to physically neutralize the threat of my presence with a display of false affection in front of the federal marshals. I did not move. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I simply locked my eyes onto his. I channeled every ounce of my disgust, every year of my betrayed love, and every fraction of my cold calculation into a single freezing look. Matthew stopped dead in his tracks. He was less than 3 feet away from me, his arms still awkwardly suspended in the air. The manufactured smile slowly melted off his face. He recognized the look in my eyes. It was the exact same look I used when I discovered a fatal structural flaw in a massive engineering project, the look that meant a building was about to be demolished. The federal marshals behind me subtly shifted their weight, their hands resting near their tactical belts, completely ready to intercept him if he took another step. Matthew slowly lowered his arms and stepped backward, retreating like a beaten dog. I walked past him without saying a word. I moved to the head of the massive granite table, the seat Matthew had so arrogantly claimed minutes before. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down. Richard Caldwell took the seat directly to my right. He placed his battered leather briefcase on the polished stone surface. The crisp snap of the brass locks echoing in the quiet room sounded like the cocking of a heavy firearm. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream at them for their betrayal. Shouting is the weapon of the weak, the desperate, and the out of control. I spoke in a low, perfectly even register that carried absolute authority. I told them to sit down. Sarah and Bradley immediately sank back into their chairs. Rachel remained frozen, her eyes darting between the federal marshals and the closed doors. Matthew stood rigidly near the end of the table, his pride violently warring with his rising terror. I looked at him and repeated my instruction, telling him to take a seat before the armed officers behind me forced him into one. Matthew swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, and slowly lowered himself into the chair furthest away from me. I nodded to Richard. The old corporate litigator opened his briefcase. He reached inside and withdrew 5 thick black presentation folders. He kept one for himself and handed one to me. Then he stood up and walked a slow, deliberate circle around the granite table. He placed a heavy black folder precisely in front of Matthew, another in front of Rachel, one for Sarah, and the final one in front of Bradley. The heavy cardstock made a dull, authoritative thud against the stone. I opened my folder. I instructed my family to do the same. Nobody moved. They stared at the black covers as if the folders were venomous snakes waiting to strike. They knew instinctively that the paper contained within those covers represented the absolute end of their comfortable, privileged lives. I looked directly at Matthew. I told him to open the folder and turn to the first page. I waited. His trembling hands finally reached out. He flipped the black cover open. I told him he was looking at a certified time-stamped transcript of a conversation recorded inside a rideshare vehicle on Tuesday afternoon. I watched his eyes scan the page. I watched the remaining blood drain from his face as he recognized his own arrogant words staring back at him in black and white text. I did not let him read it in silence. I read the transcript aloud. I read his exact quote detailing the hiring of an unlicensed psychiatric transport team. I read Rachel laughing about the padded room. I read their precise calculation to have me forcibly sedated in the middle of the night so they could steal my home by the weekend. Rachel buried her plan the kidnapping and false imprisonment. I told him he was incredibly careless. I explained that when you plan the kidnapping and false imprisonment of an innocent man, you should ensure the driver of your vehicle is not a man of profound moral integrity. I informed them that the original audio and video files were currently resting securely in the vaults of Richard Caldwell firm, ready to be handed over to the district attorney the moment I gave the command. I told them to turn to page 2. I shifted my gaze to Rachel. She slowly lowered her hands, her face streaked with tears of pure panic. I told her to look at the financial documents. I explained that I knew exactly why they needed my money so desperately. I read the bank routing numbers aloud. I detailed the precise flow of the $4 million Matthew had systematically embezzled from the commercial escrow accounts of his real estate firm. I listed the exact dates he had stolen the money belonging to his innocent clients. I read the purchase order for the exotic sports cars. I read the deed transfer for their luxurious mountain vacation home. Matthew tried to speak. He stammered, attempting to formulate a lie, attempting to claim the money was a legitimate corporate loan. I cut him off instantly. I told him not to insult my intelligence. I informed him that my forensic accountants had completely dismantled his corporate firewall in less than 6 hours. I told him the state regulatory board would not view his theft as a clerical error. They would view it as multiple counts of federal wire fraud. I promised Matthew that the moment those auditors arrived at his office next week, his career would end, his assets would be frozen, and he would be facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. I watched the absolute destruction of his pride. The wealthy, successful real estate developer was gone. In his place sat a terrified, broken criminal, realizing he was about to lose his freedom. I turned my attention to the opposite side of the table. I looked at my daughter. Sarah had always prided herself on being the perfect, untouchable suburban elite. Her pristine white cashmere sweater suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of her impending ruin. I told Sarah to turn to page 4. She did not want to touch the paper. Bradley reached over with a shaking hand and flipped the page for her. I spoke directly to my son-in-law. I told Bradley that he was a coward and a degenerate. I read the financial records detailing his massive, devastating losses to the illegal sports betting syndicates. I read the exact amounts of the panicked cash withdrawals that had completely drained their retirement savings. Then I instructed Richard to distribute the printed copies of the intercepted text messages. Sarah looked down at the paper. She read the graphic, violent threats the loan sharks had sent to her husband, threats that specifically named her and her children. Her pristine facade shattered completely. A loud, ragged sob tore from her chest. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold granite. I looked at my daughter and told her I understood everything now. I told her I understood why she was so eager to declare her own father mentally incompetent. I explained that I knew she was fully complicit in the plan to steal my life work. She was entirely willing to sacrifice my sanity, my freedom, and my legacy simply to pay off the violent criminals her weak husband had invited into their lives. I pointed to the forged medical power of attorney lying discarded on the floor near the doorway. I told them that their grand legal strategy was nothing more than a desperate, pathetic bank robbery. They had bribed corrupt doctors and paid off a criminal notary public to steal my aerospace patents because they were drowning in the consequences of their own spectacular failures. They believed they could use the legal system to mask their thievery. They assumed their father was a weak, grieving old man who would simply disappear into the darkness and let them harvest his wealth. The silence returned to the room heavier and more suffocating than before. They were completely surrounded by their own sins. Every lie, every theft, and every cruel intention was laid bare on the table in front of them. The federal marshals stood like stone sentinels, ensuring no one could escape the brutal reality of this reckoning. But the arrogance of the entitled generation is a deeply entrenched disease. It does not die easily, even when confronted with absolute proof. Sarah suddenly stopped crying. Her survival instinct, twisted and corrupted by years of privilege, violently flared to life. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, smearing her expensive makeup. She pushed her chair back and stood up. Her legs were trembling, but her eyes burned with a desperate, unhinged defiance. She pointed a shaking finger at the forged power of attorney on the floor. She looked at me, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. She screamed that none of my evidence mattered. She claimed that my private investigation meant absolutely nothing in the eyes of the law. She slammed her hand onto the granite table. She declared that the medical power of attorney was officially stamped by a district judge. She declared that the state of mind of the original account holder was irrelevant because I had been legally pronounced incompetent. She screamed that she and Matthew were the sole acting executive officers of Stanton Engineering Holdings. Sarah turned her manic gaze toward Henderson, the bank manager, who was still standing quietly near the doorway. She ordered him to ignore my presence entirely. She demanded that he march down to the central vault, immediately utilize whatever heavy machinery was necessary, and extract the physical master drives containing the aerospace patents. She claimed they had a legally binding contract with the rival aerospace corporation, and she refused to let a confused, mentally ill old man ruin their corporate sale. She stood there breathing heavily, clinging to her forged piece of paper, like a life raft in a hurricane. She actually believed she could still win. She believed she could simply talk her way past the truth, order the bank manager to comply, and walk out of the building with the millions she so desperately needed to save her husband. I looked at my daughter. I felt a profound, heavy sorrow for the monster she had become, but I felt absolutely no mercy. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a smile that communicated absolute, unstoppable destruction. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I looked directly into Sarah's wild, desperate eyes. I told her that she was perfectly welcome to take an industrial drill to the biometric vault. I told her she could melt the titanium lock, bypass the retinal scanners, and force the heavy steel doors wide open. I let the words hang in the air for a fraction of a second, ensuring she was listening to every single syllable. Then I delivered the final fatal blow. I told her she could open the vault, but it would not do her any good. Because as of 48 hours ago, I do not own those patents anymore. Sarah stared at me across the massive granite table. Her chest heaved with panicked, shallow breaths as she desperately clung to the forged medical power of attorney. She fully believed that a piece of paper stamped by a corrupt judge was an impenetrable shield. I looked at my daughter and felt a chilling absence of pity. I prepared to dismantle her delusion piece by piece. I kept my voice in a low, even register that forced everyone in the room to hold their breath just to hear me. I told Sarah that her forged documents were entirely useless. I explained that when I established the corporate charter for Stanton Engineering Holdings 30 years ago, I anticipated the potential for hostile corporate takeovers. I engineered a highly specific medical incapacitation clause into the foundational bylaws of the company. I told her that the clause explicitly stated that if I was ever declared mentally unfit by any external medical professional, all external powers of attorney regarding my intellectual property were instantly rendered null and void. I watched the realization slowly crawl across Sarah's face. I told her that the very moment she and Matthew filed those fraudulent psychiatric evaluations with the court, they triggered a permanent defensive lockdown. They did not gain the keys to my kingdom. They permanently welded the gates shut against themselves. Matthew gripped the edge of the table so tightly, his knuckles turned pure white. He stammered that the patents still existed and that they were the legal executives of the estate. He insisted they still had the authority to sell the blueprints. I offered him a cold, empty smile. I told Matthew that he was entirely incorrect. I explained that while they were busy weeping for the local news cameras and filing missing persons reports, I was sitting in a secure office with Richard Caldwell executing a silent adjustment. I revealed that I had legally activated the medical incapacitation clause. I told them I had spent the last 48 hours entirely restructuring my wealth. I announced the creation of the Catherine Stanton Memorial Foundation. I watched their faces contort in confusion and rising dread as I explained the nature of an irrevocable charitable trust. I told them that every single aerospace patent I had ever designed, every dollar of liquid capital in my personal accounts, and the deed to the massive suburban estate they coveted had been legally transferred to the foundation. I explained that the sole beneficiary of this new trust was the Metropolitan Medical Center, where their mother had died. I told them I had permanently disinherited myself to ensure they would never touch a single dime of my money. I informed them that the patents they had promised to the rival aerospace corporation no longer belonged to me, and they certainly did not belong to them. Rachel let out a sharp, pathetic whimper. Bradley sank lower into his leather chair, his eyes wide with the hollow stare of a man who realizes he is a walking corpse. But Matthew was a cornered predator. He refused to accept the reality of his defeat. He argued that the rival aerospace corporation had already accepted their executive authority. He aggressively reminded me that the buyers had already wired a $5 million advance deposit into the holding company accounts just yesterday afternoon. He claimed that, as the acting chief executive officer, he still controlled that massive sum of money. I nodded slowly, acknowledging his statement. I told Matthew he was absolutely right about the contract and the money. I then explained the second phase of my architectural trap. I told him I had intentionally left Stanton Engineering Holdings, perfectly intact as a registered corporate entity with the state. However, I had completely hollowed it out from the inside. I explained that the holding company was now nothing more than a beautifully painted facade holding absolutely no assets, no patents, and no capital. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished stone surface. I told Matthew that when he and Sarah confidently walked into the corporate high-rise yesterday, they did not sell my revolutionary structural designs. They sold thin air. I explained that they had committed blatant corporate fraud against a massive, highly aggressive aerospace conglomerate. Matthew tried to deflect. He claimed the company would be held liable, not him personally. I shattered his final defense. I told him I had filed a final addendum to the corporate bylaws moments before I transferred my assets. I explained that the new charter explicitly stated that any individual claiming unauthorized executive control over the empty shell company assumed total, inescapable personal liability for all its actions and debts. I told Matthew that he and Sarah had proudly signed their own names to the preliminary acquisition agreements. They believed they were using my company as a protective shield to harvest my wealth. I informed them they had actually strapped themselves to a massive financial bomb. Before Matthew could formulate another desperate argument, the heavy oak doors of the executive conference room opened once again. The two armed federal marshals stepped slightly apart to allow a new figure to enter the room. It was Daniel. He was no longer wearing the worn winter coat he wore during his long nights driving the rideshare vehicle. He was dressed in a crisp, dark, perfectly tailored suit. He carried a thick leather legal portfolio under his arm. He walked into the luxurious boardroom with the quiet, measured confidence of a man who fully understood the devastating power he was about to unleash. Matthew looked at the stranger in complete confusion, his mind unable to place the face. I introduced Daniel to my family. I told Matthew that this was the unseen variable in his flawless equation. I explained that this was the rideshare driver he had unknowingly hired to deliver me to his unlicensed psychiatric transport team. I informed them that Daniel was also a brilliant legal mind, a top-tier law student, who had spent his morning bypassing the security protocols of the rival aerospace corporation. Daniel did not look at Matthew with anger or malice. He looked at my son with the cold, clinical indifference one reserves for a crushed insect. Daniel walked directly to the center of the granite table. He opened his leather portfolio and extracted a thick stack of legally bound documents secured with a heavy blue ribbon. He placed the documents precisely in front of Matthew and Sarah. Daniel spoke in a clear, highly authoritative voice that commanded the entire room. He informed my children that he had hand-delivered the certified copies of my charitable trust and the amended corporate bylaws directly to the general counsel of the rival aerospace corporation exactly 30 minutes ago. Daniel explained that the executive legal team instantly recognized they had been sold fraudulent goods by two unauthorized imposters. Daniel pointed to the heavy stack of papers on the table. He announced that those documents constituted an emergency corporate lawsuit and an immediate demand for restitution. The rival aerospace corporation was officially suing Matthew Stanton, Sarah Stanton, and the empty shell of Stanton Engineering Holdings for $5 million. The specific charges were severe corporate fraud, malicious misrepresentation, and absolute breach of contract. Sarah let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. She stared at the lawsuit as if it were a physical fire burning on the polished granite. The reality of the numbers completely shattered her arrogant facade. She turned to her brother, her eyes wild with panic. She begged Matthew to simply cancel the deal. She desperately pleaded with him to wire the $5 million back to the aerospace corporation. Apologize for the misunderstanding and make the nightmare stop before they were all destroyed. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and watched the remaining color completely drain from Matthew's face. He could not look at his sister. He could not look at me. He could only stare at the legal documents sitting on the table, his breathing shallow and rapid. I broke the silence to answer my daughter. I told Sarah that her brother could not return the advance deposit. I explained that Richard Caldwell and his team of forensic accountants had been monitoring the holding company accounts in real time. I detailed exactly how they had spent the non-refundable advance the very minute the funds cleared the banking system. I told the room that $3 million had been immediately wired through a complex series of shell accounts, until it landed directly in the commercial escrow accounts of Matthew Real Estate Firm. I looked at Sarah and explained that her brother had embezzled millions from his clients, and he used the corporate advance to cover his criminal tracks before the state auditors arrived next week. Sarah whipped her head around to stare at Matthew in absolute horror. She had no idea her successful brother was a desperate thief. Then I turned my gaze to Matthew. I told him where the rest of the money went. I explained that the remaining $2 million had been wired to untraceable offshore accounts, controlled by a violent illegal sports betting syndicate. I looked at Matthew and explained that his perfect sister and her degenerate husband had used the remaining corporate funds to pay off the loan sharks who had threatened to murder their family. Matthew stared at Sarah, his jaw clenched in pure rage. They had completely hidden their catastrophic failures from each other, yet they had happily collaborated to destroy their father. Now the truth was exposed, and they realized they had mutually assured their own destruction. I laid out the final brutal mathematics of their situation. I told them the $5 million was completely gone. It had been absorbed by their respective black holes of criminal debt. The money could not be recovered, and it could not be returned. But I warned them that the rival aerospace corporation did not care about their personal problems. The corporation demanded immediate total restitution. Because Stanton Engineering Holdings was an entirely empty shell with zero capital, the corporate lawyers would effortlessly pierce the corporate veil. The lawsuit named Matthew and Sarah, individually binding them to the massive debt they had created through their forged signatures. I looked directly into my son's eyes. I told him he was now personally responsible for producing $5 million by the end of the business day. I told him the financial guillotine had finally fallen. I looked at Rachel, who was currently hyperventilating, her hands gripping her designer dress. I told her that the federal courts would immediately grant the rival corporation the authority to seize their personal assets to satisfy the fraudulent debt. I explained that the bank branch we were currently sitting in was already initiating the freeze on their personal accounts. I told Matthew that his luxurious suburban home, his exotic sports cars, and his real estate firm were now completely forfeit. They would be seized by the end of the day. I looked at Sarah and told her that her pristine colonial house, her manicured lawns, and her flawless public image were permanently destroyed. The loan sharks might not kill her husband now, but she would be living on the street by the weekend. I told them they had spent their entire adult lives operating under the fatal delusion that they were smarter and more deserving than everyone else. They believed they were inherently entitled to the fruits of my lifelong labor. They thought they could simply dispose of a grieving old man, harvest his wealth, and walk away clean. Instead, they had willingly walked into a trap of their own making and signed their own financial death warrants. I informed them that they were walking out of this bank building with absolutely nothing but the expensive clothes on their backs and a massive corporate debt they could not pay off in 10 lifetimes. The air in the VIP conference room had become heavy and toxic. It was choked by the sudden violent death of their entitlement. Matthew sat slumped in his leather chair, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He stared at the polished granite table as if the stone itself had betrayed him. He finally understood the inescapable mathematics of his destruction. He was utterly bankrupt, and he was completely exposed. Sarah was weeping uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands, her pristine image entirely shattered by the reality of the $5 million corporate lawsuit resting in front of her. They had believed they were the architects of my demise, but they were merely the final victims of their own staggering greed. The silence of their defeat was suddenly broken by the heavy rhythmic sound of tactical boots stepping forward. The taller of the two federal marshals moved away from the heavy oak doors. He unclipped a set of steel handcuffs from his leather belt. Matthew instinctively raised his hands, his eyes darting wildly around the room, as if expecting the armed officer to protect him from the financial ruin I had just delivered. He fundamentally misunderstood the situation. The marshal did not stop beside my chair. He walked directly to the opposite end of the massive granite table. He grabbed Matthew by the shoulder of his expensive, bespoke suit, and forcefully pulled him to his feet. The marshal ordered my son to place his hands behind his back. Matthew tried to resist. He stammered frantically, claiming there had been a terrible misunderstanding, demanding to call his corporate lawyers. The marshal ignored his pathetic protests. He twisted Matthew's arms backward with practiced clinical efficiency. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly off the mahogany walls. The second federal marshal stepped forward and approached Sarah. She shrank back into her chair, screaming for her husband to do something. Bradley remained entirely paralyzed, pressing himself against the wall, as if hoping to blend into the wood paneling. The officer grabbed Sarah by her wrists, pulling her up from the chair. She fought wildly, her white cashmere sweater tearing slightly as the cold steel cuffs were locked securely into place. The lead marshal pulled a folded document from his tactical vest. He looked directly at my son and my daughter, his voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority. He announced that he was executing immediate federal arrest warrants. He recited the Miranda rights with a cold, rhythmic precision that made the nightmare completely real. Then he read the charges. He informed Matthew and Sarah that they were being placed under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud stemming from the massive embezzlement of commercial escrow accounts. He stated they were being charged with criminal forgery for fabricating medical documents and bribing a judicial notary. Finally, he looked at Matthew and announced the most severe charge of all. He charged my son with aggravated elder abuse and conspiracy to commit false imprisonment for hiring the unlicensed psychiatric extraction team. The bank manager Henderson stood completely frozen near the doorway, watching the wealthy clients he had feared just moments ago being treated like common street criminals. The corporate executives had been entirely stripped of their power. They were no longer the acting officers of Stanton Engineering Holdings. They were federal inmates. I turned my attention to the corners of the room. I looked at the spouses who had willingly participated in the attempted slaughter of my legacy. Rachel was staring at Matthew with absolute disgust. The man she had married for his money and his status was now a massive financial liability, a handcuffed criminal carrying a $5 million corporate lawsuit. She was already mentally calculating how fast she could pack her designer bags and flee the city. Bradley looked completely hollowed out. The loan sharks might not kill him today, but he knew his wife was going to prison, and he had absolutely no money left to hide from his violent debts. I placed my hands on the polished granite table and pushed myself up from my chair. I buttoned my suit jacket with slow, deliberate precision. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. I felt the profound, quiet satisfaction of an engineer who had successfully executed the controlled demolition of a deeply corrupted structure. I had removed the rot from my life entirely. I looked down at Matthew and Sarah. They were weeping, their faces red and streaked with tears, begging me to call off the marshals. They pleaded with me to show mercy, calling me their father, invoking the very family bonds they had tried to weaponize against me. I did not respond to them. They were no longer my children. They were simply the consequences of their own actions. Instead, I shifted my gaze to Rachel and Bradley. I looked at my daughter-in-law and my son-in-law with a perfectly calm, freezing expression. I advised them to leave the bank immediately and hire very cheap divorce lawyers. I informed them that their spouses no longer possessed a single dollar to pay for expensive legal representation, and their personal assets would be seized by the federal courts before the sun went down. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family. I did not offer a final goodbye. I did not look over my shoulder as the federal marshals aggressively marched Matthew and Sarah toward the heavy oak doors. I walked out of the VIP conference room alongside Richard Caldwell and Daniel. We stepped into the elevator, leaving the screaming, crying remnants of my past behind on the third floor. When the heavy glass doors of the bank lobby opened, I stepped out onto the busy city sidewalk. The cold November air hit my face, but it no longer felt bitter. It felt incredibly clean. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the absolute certainty of my victory. I had burned my own empire to the ground, but in doing so I had forged an unbreakable armor. I was completely free. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the downtown bank closed behind me, sealing the fate of the people I once called family. The violent storm I unleashed has long since settled into a quiet, permanent reality. Tonight, I find myself exactly where this entire journey began. I am walking the softly lit corridors of the Metropolitan Medical Center. The pediatric ward is asleep. The gentle hum of life support monitors and the soft footsteps of the night shift nurses are the only sounds breaking the absolute silence of the early morning. I carry a stack of newly donated picture books, arranging them neatly on the low wooden shelves of the playroom. There is a profound, unshakable peace resting heavily in my chest. I do not miss the massive suburban estate. I do not miss the millions of dollars in my personal bank accounts, or the heavy burden of managing a corporate empire. Just down the hall from this playroom, a newly constructed set of glass double doors leads to a state-of-the-art surgical facility. Above those doors, forged in simple, elegant silver lettering, is the William Stanton Pediatric Cardiology Wing. I poured the entirety of my life work, every aerospace patent, and every accumulated corporate dividend into making that wing a physical reality. I traded an empire of cold steel and concrete for an empire of healing and hope. Every time a child is saved in those operating rooms Catherine lives on, I have turned our shared grief into a permanent beacon of light. I rarely think about my biological children anymore. Their names occasionally appear in the back pages of the local newspaper, usually chronicling the latest disastrous developments in their ongoing federal trials. Matthew is currently awaiting sentencing in a maximum security detention center. His fraudulent real estate business was completely liquidated to pay a fraction of the massive restitution he owes to the rival aerospace corporation and his stolen clients. Rachel divorced him the moment the handcuffs clicked shut, taking whatever hidden jewelry she could carry. Sarah is living in a cramped, subsidized apartment on the dangerous edge of the city. She works a minimum-wage retail job while she desperately fights personal bankruptcy and the lingering, terrifying threats of her ex-husband, criminal creditors. Bradley fled the state entirely, leaving her to face the wolves alone. They sought to lock me away in a dark, medicated cell to steal a fortune they did not earn. In the end, they meticulously built their own prisons. I feel absolutely no guilt for their current circumstances. I simply provided the heavy rope they so desperately requested, and they eagerly chose to tie the knot themselves. The universe has a perfect way of balancing the scales of justice when you possess the courage to remove your own blindfold. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my volunteer shift comes to a quiet end. I walk out through the sliding glass doors of the main hospital lobby. The spring air is crisp and cold, carrying the faint, clean scent of approaching rain. I walk toward the illuminated curb, carrying 2 large black coffees in a standard cardboard carrier. A sleek black luxury town car is idling quietly by the entrance. It is a massive upgrade from the worn, rattling sedan that picked me up on that fateful night 6 months ago. As I approach the vehicle, the tinted passenger window glides down smoothly. Sitting behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel is Daniel. He is no longer an exhausted, desperate rideshare driver drowning in the impossible weight of medical debt. He wears a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. His posture is upright, radiating the quiet confidence of a man who has conquered his darkest demons. Following the complete and anonymous erasure of his daughter's medical bills, Daniel poured his brilliant mind entirely into his studies. His little girl is now thriving, her heart fully repaired by the very surgeons who work in my late wife's new medical wing. Unburdened by the terror of poverty, Daniel graduated at the absolute top of his law school class. He passed the rigorous state bar examination on his very first attempt. I proudly stood beside him at his swearing-in ceremony, officially sponsoring his legal certification. Today, he does not drive strangers through the industrial parks for spare change. He serves as the Chief Executive Legal Counsel for the William Stanton Memorial Foundation. He aggressively protects the charity Massive Endowment with the same fierce loyalty he showed me when I was a stranger in his back seat. I open the heavy car door and slide into the comfortable leather passenger seat. I hand Daniel one of the steaming black coffees. He accepts it with a firm nod and a genuine smile of profound respect. We do not need to exchange empty pleasantries or recount the battles of the past. The bond between us was forged in the dangerous fires of a midnight betrayal, and it is cemented by a mutual understanding of duty, honor, and sacrifice. Daniel shifts the car into drive, and we pull away from the towering hospital complex. We do not drive toward a sprawling, lonely mansion hidden behind iron gates. We drive toward a modest, quiet home nestled in a peaceful neighborhood filled with ancient trees. It is a home filled with good literature, warm light, and absolute security. I lean my head back against the soft leather headrest and watch the city streetlights blur past the window. I reflect on the incredible journey that brought me to this exact moment. I have learned the most valuable lesson of my long life, a lesson paid for with the destruction of my own family tree. Society constantly teaches us that power is inherently loud. Society claims that power is found in screaming demands, aggressive posturing, the ruthless accumulation of wealth, and the domination of others. But that is the desperate illusion of the weak and the entitled. True power does not roar. True power is the quiet, immovable boundary of a man who respects himself enough to burn his own empire to the ground just to ensure the vultures starve. The greatest lesson I learned from the ashes of my own family is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and age does not equate to weakness. We spend our entire lives building sturdy foundations for our children, hoping they will stand tall upon them. But when they choose to dismantle those very foundations out of pure greed, we must possess the profound courage to walk away. Respect is the only true currency of a family. If you allow entitled people to view your lifelong generosity as a mere resource to be exploited, they will eventually try to consume you completely. True power is drawing an immovable boundary and having the absolute strength to enforce it, even if it means standing completely alone in the end. If you believe that toxic family members must face the absolute consequences of their actions, hit the subscribe button and share your own stories of setting boundaries in the comments below.